In this video, we'll go through the process of creating something known as a metallic map, or metal map for short. So what is a metal map? The metal map essentially describes to the game engine, shader, software, whatever you're using, we're basically describing what is and isn't metal. And like with the roughness map, it works in grayscales. So if I quickly go to the PBR guide really quick from Algorithmic. It does have a really nice breakdown as to what the metal map does. So essentially, like it says here, it tells Shader how it should interpret the data from the base color or albedo map. And a lot of times, as it says, is that if you're working with pure raw metal, so for instance, if you're working with pure gold, steel, aluminum, for instance, those will be represented as black, as they're pure metal. If it's say wood, for instance, that's not metallic whatsoever, we'd have that as white. So we need to look at our materials and look at our objects and think, okay, how old is this? Has this been oxidized, for instance? Has it been around for many years? Is it a painted metal, for instance? And we need to make sure that we're working with those grayscales to appropriately showcase what is or isn't metal. So you can really see here in this example right now is that there's a lot of rust elements to this object right now. Just zoom in a little bit more to it. So you can see here there's a lot of rusted elements to it. Again, which wouldn't be very metal, because again, that's the oxidization process. The red here as well, this is again a painted metal. And when you paint metal, it's not going to be as shiny, or it's not really the pure raw metal that you would have. So for instance, you can see these scratches here where the paint's been chipped off. Again, that exposes the pure metal. So you would make sure that your metal map would translate that information accordingly. So here it's more like sort of like a lighter grey, or it's almost like pure white. So you'll probably find that a lot of times you'll be working in pretty much binary black and white elements to it. However, you may find that depending on oxidization, or for instance, if you have like say dirt or grime, for instance, that's really strong and really on there, you have to make sure that in your metal map that you would make sure that that is pretty much almost entirely black, or pretty much like a very dark grey. They make a really good example here as well, which talks about the corroding elements to metal as well. So it is well worth a read. So you can see here it talks about it as well. So for example, if you look at the painted metal, so I highly suggest reading this just to kind of get a bit more information on the metal map. But essentially, you'll most likely be working in black and whites. So it's a pretty straightforward map to create. You just get a very simple sort of black and white elements to it. So I can see here I got my albedo, and this is my metallic map. So all I've done essentially was I've taken my albedo map, I've duplicated it across. If I just get rid of, let's say, the scratches, for instance, don't really need that. Don't need this, don't need that. I'm just keeping with the base metal and wood for right now. So for instance, the wood. This is not metal whatsoever, so there's no two ways about it. It would be pretty much completely black, essentially. So I just made those black because again, this isn't really going to be just quickly call that in. Once Photoshop doesn't crash on me. So yeah, I've defined this now as pretty much being a non-metal. Then for my metal, again, this is quite, I would say it is quite raw. I would say it's more like a raw metal, probably like iron, for instance. So I would probably go to image adjustments, brightness and contrast, and probably just whack up the brightness to it a lot, because you can see there is some elements to this metal here as well. As I whack up, you can really see that there's some sort of like darker grey areas which will kind of show up as well. So maybe I don't want those, so I probably want to whack down the contrast, for instance. And again, I could just play around with the levels and curves as well, just to kind of experiment with this. And that would create me a really basic metal map where I've defined elements such as the pure metal and the not so pure metal. But again, for instance, if this metal was quite old or corroded, for instance, so if I really quickly create a layer, just get a paintbrush. So in my albedo map, if I had any sort of like dirts or really intense scratches on the actual metal itself, I would make sure to define those in the metal map here as well. Because again, if you're going to be rotating around the object, and if it's trying to define what's metal and what's not, if you've got really strong rust or really sort of grime on the albedo map, you have to make sure that that translates well into the metal map as well. So maybe if it's like grime, for instance, maybe like sort of like a darker grey, because some of the metal might be seeping through it. So something like that, for instance, would probably be a lot more appropriate to kind of appropriately translate what is metal and what isn't metal. So again, the metal map is quite a simple, easy one to play around with. Shouldn't take it too long if you've got a very basic binary metal and what's not metal. But yeah, that's pretty much the simplest way of doing it. Black meaning that it's not metal, white meaning that it is. But play around with it, experiment, see what works, what doesn't work. And again, like here as well, you can really see like you can add a nice bit of nice sort of micro details to this. You know, the fact that you can probably have some paint that's chipped away to expose some of the original metal does highlight some really nice extra details to the model itself. So again, you can kind of tell a little bit of a story with the metal map, but it's not as impressive as some of the other maps, for instance. But still, play around and experiment with this particular texture process.